There were only 3 signatures standing between me and homelessness, and 2 of them were already on the page. My son Philip's scrawl, eager and jagged. His wife Diana's, a perfect, sterile loop. They slid the house transfer documents across the up table, the polished wood reflecting their hungry faces. The pen they offered me was cold and heavy, a silver bullet aimed at the last 40 years of my life. Outside, a cold wind rattled the windows of the small duplex I had called home. "Just here, Dad," Philip said, his voice a strained imitation of patience. He tapped a manicured finger on the empty line. He was a stranger in this room, a place where I had taught him to read, a place that smelled of old books and Mary's lavender sachets. Now, it just smelled of Diana's sharp, expensive perfume. The 2 of them were a splash of harsh color against the worn, beige comfort of my life. They wanted the house, valued at $280,000, and they wanted it tonight. I looked down at the paper, my old teacher eyes scanning the dense legal text they assumed I couldn't comprehend. They were so sure of themselves, so confident in my frailty. But in their rush, they'd missed the addendum on page 2, stapled neatly behind the main deed. It was a detail as small and as crucial as a decimal point. A detail that would unravel everything they had planned. My heart gave a steady, determined thump. The game was not over. It had just begun. It all started 6 months ago, when Philip lost his high-paying tech job. Suddenly, their sprawling suburban rental felt like a gilded cage. Their 2 expensive cars, a burden. My paid-off duplex, a solution. "It's just more practical, Dad," he had explained over a tense dinner. "Diana and I could fix it up, sell it. You could move into a nice, managed facility." He said managed facility, the way one might say luxury cruise, but we all knew he meant a cheap, state-run nursing home. Diana was the architect of the plan. I saw it in the way she looked at the scuffs on the baseboards and the faded floral wallpaper. Her gaze was an appraisal, stripping the house of its memories and seeing only its market value. "The bones are good," she'd said to her friend on the phone, her voice carrying from the kitchen. "But the whole place needs to be gutted. It's so beige. My life, my home, my comfort, all dismissed with a single contemptuous word. Beige." Now, the silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had measured out my life in steady, reliable increments. It was a sound they wanted to silence. Philip cleared his throat, a nervous, impatient noise. "We don't have all night, Dad. The notary is waiting." He gestured vaguely towards the front door, a lie as transparent as the glass he was pointing at. There was no notary, just them and their greed. "I just need a moment to read it," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Diana let out a sigh, a gust of manufactured frustration. "Franklin, it's a standard transfer. Philip's lawyer drew it up. It's all perfectly normal." Her use of my first name was a deliberate barb, a way of repositioning me from father to dependent, a child who needed his affairs managed. She smiled, a thin, sharp line. "You don't want to be a burden, do you?" The property insult hung in the air, thick and choking. My son, my own flesh and blood, refused to meet my eyes. He stared at the spot on the wall, just over my shoulder, his jaw tight. He was a good boy, once, but he was weak, and Diana was strong. Strong in her wants, her ambitions. She was a predator who had scented a weakness in the herd. And I, the old slow stag, was the target. The scent of her perfume seemed to fill my lungs, a cloying, invasive smell that made it hard to breathe. I ran a thumb over the crisp edge of the paper. The texture reminded me of the report cards I used to fill out by hand, each one a careful judgment. This document was a report card for my son, and he was failing spectacularly. He was failing the memory of his mother, Mary, the woman who had poured her heart into this home. He was failing the lessons of integrity I had tried so hard to teach him. He was trading his heritage for a quick cash payout. My eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, to a small, unassuming wooden box sitting next to a picture of Mary. It was an old cigar box, filled with sticks of brittle, dusty chalk, a silly sentimental thing. To Philip and Diana, it was just another piece of clutter to be thrown out. But to me, it was an heirloom. That box held a promise I had made to my wife on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. A promise sealed with the squeak of chalk on a small blackboard we kept in the kitchen. That box of old chalk was the key. It was the physical manifestation of the trust amendment they had so carelessly overlooked. They saw an old man in a worthless house. They didn't see the retired teacher who had spent his life understanding rules, clauses, and the fine print. They didn't understand that the quietest people are often the most observant. They were playing checkers, while I had been setting up a chessboard for the past 6 months. It was a game they were about to lose. "It's getting late," Diana pressed, her voice edged with steel. "We have a reservation. A celebratory dinner." The thought was so grotesque, it was almost funny. They planned to feast on the corpse of my life before it was even cold. I imagined them at a fancy restaurant, raising glasses of champagne, while I sat in a sterile room somewhere, staring at a beige wall. The silence broken only by the coughing of strangers. A cold fury, clean and sharp, began to solidify in my chest. Philip finally looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Dad, please, don't make this difficult. We're trying to help you. The house is too much for you." He spoke of the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, the garden I'd let go wild this past season. Every word was a carefully chosen brick, building a prison of incompetence around me. He was using my grief, my quiet slowing down since Mary's passing, as a weapon. He was turning my love for his mother into a justification for his own betrayal. The contrast was stark, their vibrant, expensive clothes against my faded cardigan. The sleek, modern pen they'd brought versus the chipped mug of lukewarm tea at my elbow. The silence of my small duplex versus the loud, fast world they lived in, a world I was apparently no longer fit for. They saw decay where I saw comfort. They saw an asset where I saw a sanctuary. The gulf between us was no longer just generational. It was a chasm of values, of love, of memory. I let the silence stretch, enjoying the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. For the first time, they seemed to consider the possibility that I wasn't going to simply obey. They had expected a sigh, the tremble of the hand, a sad, defeated signature. They had not expected a pause. They had not expected resistance. A small, unfamiliar spark of fear appeared in Philip's gaze. He was seeing his father, the teacher, the man who graded his papers, not just the elderly dependent he had decided I was. Diana, ever the tactician, changed her approach. Her voice softened, becoming syrupy and false. "Think of it, Franklin. No more worries. No more repairs. We've even spoken to the Hendersons from next door. We're having them over for a small get-together to celebrate the new arrangement once everything is settled." The cruelty was breathtaking. They were going to parade my defeat in front of my neighbors, turning my quiet life into a public spectacle. The humiliation was a calculated part of their strategy. The mention of the Hendersons was a mistake on her part. Bill Henderson was a retired lawyer, a good man who had helped me with my will after Mary passed. He was a witness, not to this sordid transaction, but to something far more important. A conversation we'd had last spring, over the fence, while admiring his roses. A conversation Diana could not possibly know about. Her web had a hole in it, and she had just pointed it out to me. I slowly reached for the pen, my knuckles white. I let them see the tremor in my hand, playing the part they had assigned me. Let them think it was age, not anger, that made me shake. I uncapped it with a soft click that echoed in the tense room. Philip's shoulders relaxed slightly. Diana's thin smile returned. They thought they had won. They saw the old man beaten and frail, ready to surrender his last bastion of independence for a quiet life. I nodded slowly, letting them believe they had broken me. "You're right," I whispered, my voice raspy. "It's for the best." The relief on their faces was sickening, a wave of triumphant greed. They leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the tip of the pen as I lowered it to the paper. But that was only half the truth. It was for the best, yes, but not for them. My agreement was not surrender. It was the spring of the trap. I had spent 35 years teaching history to teenagers. I knew how to handle bullies and entitled children. You don't meet them with force. You let them overplay their hand. You let their own arrogance become their undoing. Philip and Diana were no different from the sneering students in the back row who thought they were smarter than the old man at the front of the class. They always underestimated the quiet ones, a lesson they were long overdue to learn. My mind was a fortress of calm. I thought of Mary and the promise I'd made. Her last weeks were spent in this house, in the sunroom overlooking the garden. "Don't let them ever make you feel small, Frank," she had told me, her voice thin as a reed, but her grip on my hand as strong as ever. "This house is our story. Don't let them tear out the pages." I would not fail her. This was the second time I thought of her tonight, and her memory was a shield. The pen hovered over the signature line. The black ink was a stark contrast to the creamy beige paper. One stroke, and my life would be irrevocably altered. But the power was not in their hands, or even in this pen. It was in the words they hadn't bothered to read. It was in a dusty box of chalk. It was in a conversation with a neighbor over a rose bush. The pieces were all there. A puzzle they were too arrogant to see. Just as the nib was about to touch the paper, I stopped. I looked up, feigning confusion. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice deliberately frail. "My eyes aren't what they used to be. This little bit here, on the second page, what does this clause mean? The one about the chalk trust addendum?" I tapped the staple, the one they had ignored. My finger rested on the title of the document that would seal their fate instead of mine. Philip frowned, snatching the papers back. Diana leaned in, her brow furrowed in annoyance. "What addendum? It's just boilerplate legal stuff, Dad." He flipped the page impatiently, his eyes scanning the text. For the first time, a flicker of genuine confusion crossed his face. He saw the title, the legal jargon, my signature from 5 years ago, and another signature next to it, a witness. Bill Henderson, the retired lawyer from next door. The air in the room suddenly became very, very cold. "Chalk, trust." Diana mouthed the words, her voice a disbelieving whisper. The confidence drained from her face, replaced by a daunting horror. The name was nonsense, a silly, sentimental phrase they couldn't possibly comprehend. But it was legally binding, and it tied the ownership of this house, not to me, not to them, but to the contents of that dusty cigar box on the mantelpiece. The trap had been sprung. Now it was time to watch them struggle. "It's quite simple, really," I began. "Your mother was a sentimental woman," I said, my voice as steady as a rock, "and a very clever one. She knew your appetites, Philip. The addendum stipulates that full ownership of this house can only be transferred to a person who can explain the significance of the contents of that box." I gestured with my chin towards the old cigar box. She called it the chalk trust, a test of memory, a test of love, a test you have already failed spectacularly. Philip stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. "That's insane. That can't be legal." Diana recovered faster, her eyes narrowing into venomous slits. "This is a trick, a pathetic little game from a senile old man. That piece of paper means nothing. The house is ours." She took a step towards the mantelpiece, her intention clear. She was going to take the box. She was going to destroy the heart of the trust, assuming that would nullify the document itself. A foolish, predictable move. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," I said calmly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through their panic like a shard of glass. "Everything is recorded." I nodded towards the corner of the living room, where a small, blinking red light glowed from the smoke detector. It wasn't a smoke detector. It was a high-fidelity audio and video recorder I'd had installed 2 weeks ago. Another detail they had failed to notice in their greed. Their heads snapped towards the corner. The blood drained from Diana's face, leaving a mask of chalky white fury. Philip looked like he was going to be sick. "You recorded us," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "That's illegal," Diana shrieked, her voice cracking. Perfectly legal in a one-party consent state when it's your own home, I replied, quoting the exact legal advice Bill Henderson had given me. Every threat, every insult, every mention of your notary who isn't here, it's all saved. The house, my quiet, beige sanctuary, was now a courtroom, and I was the judge, jury, and prosecution. The evidence was irrefutable. Their coercion, their emotional abuse, the blatant attempt at fraud. The shiny silver pen lay forgotten on the table, its purpose now obsolete. The power they thought they held had evaporated, leaving behind only the ugly residue of their intentions. They had walked into my home to strip me of everything, and instead, they had stripped themselves bare. Diana, recovering her venom, sneered. Fine, keep your dusty old house, we'll sue. We'll tell the court you're incompetent. We'll drain every last cent you have fighting this. You'll be in a home one way or another, Franklin. The threat was hollow, the last gasp of a cornered animal. But the cruelty of it, the sheer naked aggression from my son's wife, was still a physical blow. I let her words hang in the air, a testament to her character, all dutifully recorded. You could try, I conceded, giving a small, sad shrug. But it will get expensive, and very public. Especially when the recording of your phone call from last Tuesday is played in open court. I watched the last bit of color drain from Philip's face. He knew exactly what call I meant. The one he'd made to Diana from his car, thinking he was safe. Well, his phone was still connected to the Bluetooth speaker in my kitchen. The speaker I had gifted him for Christmas. I remembered the moment perfectly. I was in the living room corner, quietly reading, when his voice suddenly filled the kitchen. He's getting so frail, Di. Philip's recorded voice had said, tinny and distant. He won't even know what he's signing. A week after the transfer, we'll have him in the cheapest facility we can find. Just smile and tell him it's for the best. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, it left me breathless. But that was only half the truth. The other half was Diana's reply, crystal clear over the speaker. Just get it done, Phil. I'm tired of waiting. I've already got the contractor lined up to gut the place. We can have it on the market by early spring and be in Costa Rica before the summer. Their entire, sordid plan, laid bare by their own carelessness. That was the moment my grief turned to strategy. That was the moment the retired teacher decided to prepare one final, comprehensive lesson plan. Now, seeing the memory of that conversation reflected in their horrified eyes was a grim sort of victory. They weren't just thieves, they were incompetent thieves. They had been so consumed by their endgame that they had tripped over every wire I had laid for them. They had underestimated not just my mind, but my understanding of the modern world they worshipped. The technology they saw as a tool, I saw as a weapon they had handed to me. Philip sank into a chair, his head in his hands. He was broken, but Diana was made of something harder. Her fear was rapidly crystallizing back into rage. Her eyes darted around the room, a predator looking for a new angle of attack. She saw the house transfer papers on the table, the pen, the chalk box on the mantel. She was calculating, recalibrating. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to mock her, each second a reminder of her failure. This changes nothing, she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. But recording can be faked. The trust is ridiculous. No judge will uphold it. We are his family. You are his son, Philip. Are you going to let him do this to us? She turned on him, her fury now directed at her accomplice, her husband. She was trying to salvage the situation, to rally her broken soldier. But Philip didn't move. He just sat there, a hollowed-out version of the son I once knew. This was the moment where they thought I had reached my limit. They saw an old man who had played his one trick, revealed his one secret. They assumed I had nothing left. I could see it in Diana's eyes. She believed she could still overwhelm me with sheer force of will, with legal threats and emotional blackmail. She thought I was bluffing about the rest. The odds were still 2 against 1. In their minds, I was still just a feeble old man in a beige cardigan. I let the silence hang for a beat, letting her words curdle in the air. I had them exactly where I wanted them, arrogant, desperate, and completely unaware of the final, decisive blow yet to come. The trust amendment and the recordings were just the setup. They were the left jab. The right hook was a simple piece of financial paperwork I had filed 3 months ago, an action inspired by that overheard phone call, an action they could not possibly anticipate. "You talk about suing," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "That will be difficult. You see, a lawsuit requires money for lawyers. And as of March 12, 2019, your primary source of emergency funding is no longer available to you." I watched Philip's head slowly rise. He knew what I was talking about. A flicker of dawning, ultimate dread appeared in his eyes. It was a wound far deeper than the loss of this house. It was a betrayal he never saw coming. "What are you talking about?" Diana demanded. "What funding?" I turned my gaze to my son. "The trust fund your grandfather set up for you, Philip. The one I have managed as the sole trustee for the past 30 years. The one you've been borrowing against for your cars and your lifestyle. The one you were counting on to keep you afloat after you lost your job." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. I made a small administrative change. The trust had a discretionary clause, a beautiful little piece of legal writing my father, a far more suspicious man than I, had insisted upon. It gave the trustee, me, the power to redirect the funds in the event of moral turpitude on the part of the beneficiary. For years, it was just words on a page. After I overheard their plan, those words became my sword and my shield. I had submitted the paperwork to my lawyer the very next day. "You can't do that," Philip whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. The last prayer of a condemned man. "I can," I said simply. And I did. The entire remaining balance, a little over $400,000, has been irrevocably transferred. The beneficiary has been changed. Diana stared at me, her mind clearly racing, trying to process the magnitude of her loss. The house was one thing, but this was a financial kill shot. This was the end of their world. "To who?" she breathed, the word barely audible. "Who did you give it to?" I allowed myself the smallest, coldest smile. "To someone your mother would have approved of. Someone who understands the value of home, of loyalty. Someone who has been there for me these past few years without asking for a single thing in return." The pieces were clicking into place in Philip's mind. I could see the connections firing behind his eyes. The neighbor, the witness, the friend. "Henderson?" Philip choked out the name. "You gave my inheritance to Bill Henderson's daughter? The one who's a single mother? The one who brings you your groceries sometimes?" He looked at me as if I were a monster, as if my act of charity was a greater crime than his own avarice. The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. He saw no connection between his actions and my own. He saw only his own loss, his own punishment. Diana let out a sound, a strangled, guttural noise of pure rage. She lunged, not at me, but at the house transfer documents still on the table. She grabbed them and tore them in half, then in half again, the sharp ripping sound echoing the destruction of her plans. It was a pointless, theatrical gesture. The original was filed with my lawyer. All she was destroying was a copy, a symbol of her utter and complete defeat. "It's your coat, Philip," she snarled, her face a mask of hatred. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. To look at me would be to acknowledge the totality of her miscalculation. I was no longer an obstacle. I was the architect of her ruin. The beige, faded old man had checkmated her in a game she didn't even know she was playing. She had come for a house and had lost a small fortune, her future, and what little dignity she had. My son, however, did not move. He just stared at the pieces of shredded paper on the floor. He looked smaller, diminished. The expensive suit he wore seemed to hang off him, a costume for a part he could no longer play. He wasn't a predator. He was just a weak boy who had followed a stronger, more ruthless animal into a trap. And now he was caught, left behind as his partner fled the scene. He finally looked up at me, his eyes hollow. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. It was the question of a child, a question that came years too late. Why did I protect myself? Why did I honor his mother's wishes? Why did I hold him accountable for his own greed? The answer was too complex and too simple for him to ever understand. It was in every book I had ever read him, every lesson I had ever taught him. It was in the worn fabric of the armchair he was sitting in. It was in the silence of the house. I didn't answer him. There was nothing left to say. The lesson was over. I stood up, the stiffness in my old bones a dull ache. I walked over to the mantelpiece, my back to my son and his ruined wife. I picked up the old cigar box, its familiar weight a comfort in my hands. The dusty, sweet smell of old wood and chalk filled my senses for the third time tonight. It was the scent of a promise kept. I turned, a single piece of white chalk in my hand. I walked over to the small blackboard that still hung by the kitchen door, the one Mary used for grocery lists and daily affirmations. I held up the piece of chalk, its white dust coating my fingertips. The sensory motif, the chalky texture, now in the palm of my hand. Do you remember this, Philip? Your mother taught you your letters on this board. She would draw a star for every book you finished. The memory was a ghost in the room, one only I could see. The test was simple, I continued, my voice even. The trust states that the house passes to the one who honors the spirit of this home, not its monetary value. The one who could answer a single question. What was the last thing your mother wrote on this board before she got too weak to stand? I looked at my son, whose face was a blank canvas of confusion and shame. He had no idea. He hadn't been paying attention. Not then, not now, not ever. Diana scoffed. This is ridiculous, a children's game. It was a love letter, I said, turning to face her fully. The last thing she wrote, in big, shaky letters, was who will water my roses. A simple question, not about money or deeds, but about care, about tending to something beautiful for its own sake. The chalk was the key, and the question was the lock. You came here with a sledgehammer, when all you needed was to remember to be a son. Philip flinched, as if I had struck him. The memory hit him then, I could see it. A flash of a forgotten afternoon, the smell of chalk dust, his mother's tired smile. A memory he had buried under years of ambition and resentment. The understanding didn't bring him peace, only a deeper, more profound agony. He had not just failed to secure an asset, he had failed a final test from his own mother. The inheritance wasn't the house, it was the memory. And he had squandered it. I've heard enough. Diana snapped. She grabbed her $1,000 purse from the floor. Philip, we are leaving, now. Her voice was stripped of all its earlier charm, leaving only the raw, ugly mechanics of command. She was cutting her losses, abandoning the entire disastrous campaign. She looked at Philip, still slumped in the chair, and her eyes were full of contempt. Not for me, but for him, for his weakness, for his failure to deliver what she had been promised. He didn't respond, just stared at the floor. Did you hear me? She demanded, taking a step towards him. Or are you going to sit there and let this old man humiliate you completely? The father versus son dynamic had been her weapon, but now she was using it as a bludgeon against him. The chilling certainty of my payback was now a reality, and she was turning on her own. It was a classic betrayal, the final act of a failed partnership. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Philip rose to his feet. He looked old, older than me. The sharp suit that had made him look so powerful now seemed like a hollow costume. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He walked towards the door, a man being led to his own execution. Diana was already there, holding it open, the cold spring wind blowing in, a harbinger of the cold new reality they were stepping into. Their united front was shattered. Wait, I said. They both froze, Diana with her hand on the doorknob, Philip with his back to me. I walked past them, past their shocked faces, and retrieved the torn pieces of the house transfer document from the floor. I didn't say a word. I simply carried the shredded remains of their ambition over to the fireplace and dropped them onto the cold ashes of last winter's fires. A final, symbolic act of closure. The document was worthless, but the gesture was everything. Then I turned back to them. Don't forget your pen, I said, pointing to the silver pen still lying on the oak table. "I'm sure you'll need it for the next deal." The insult was quiet, precise, and it landed with the force of a physical blow. Diana snatched the pen from the table, her knuckles white. She shoved it into her purse without looking at it, a tool of her defeat. It was no longer a symbol of power, but of failure. They stood, framed in the doorway for a moment, silhouetted against the dark street. Across the way, I could see the warm lights of the Hendersons' house, my neighbors. Bill was visible through the window, reading in his armchair. The small, peaceful domestic scene was a world away from the ugly drama that had just unfolded in my home. My son and his wife were now outsiders, banished from the warmth and cast into the cold darkness they had created for themselves. Diana pulled a stunned Philip out onto the porch. She didn't spare me a final glance. Her focus was entirely on escaping the scene of her humiliation. I watched them scurry down the path to their ridiculously oversized car, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. They looked like burglars caught in the act, fleeing not with loot, but with the heavy burden of their own exposure. The public presence of my quiet neighborhood now served as a silent jury to their walk of shame. The car door slammed, a sharp, angry sound in the quiet evening. The engine roared to life, an obnoxious intrusion on the neighborhood's peace. For a moment, the headlights swept across my front window, illuminating me as I stood in my own doorway, the master of my domain. They saw me. I know they did. A calm, immovable figure in a beige cardigan, a man who had refused to be broken, a father who had finally, decisively, said no. Then they were gone, the red taillights shrinking into the distance, leaving only the familiar silence behind. The cold wind still swirled around the doorway, but it felt different now. It felt clean, like a storm that had passed, clearing the air of something toxic and suffocating. The house felt lighter, bigger. It was mine again, completely and utterly. The ticking of the grandfather clock was no longer a countdown to my displacement, but the steady, reassuring heartbeat of my home. I stood there for a long moment, simply breathing, the sharp scent of the night air, the distant hum of the city, the faint smell of chalk dust on my hands. I thought for the briefest of moments of Mary, of her roses, which would need watering tomorrow, of the promise I had kept. My quiet life had been threatened, my peace shattered, but I had held the line. I had done what was necessary. The plan was complete, the vector of their attack utterly reversed. I looked down at the piece of chalk still in my hand. It was small, worn, and utterly insignificant to anyone else. But tonight, it had been more powerful than any legal document, any amount of money. It was a symbol of a love they had forgotten, a language they no longer spoke. It was a testament to the fact that the most valuable things in this world are not the ones that can be bought or sold, but the ones that must be earned, remembered, and cherished. My work was done. There were no more words to be said, no more lessons to be taught. The emotional and financial carnage I had wrought was their burden to carry, not mine. I was simply a retired teacher who had been forced to prepare one final, brutal exam. They had failed on every conceivable level. Now, it was time to clean the classroom and turn out the lights. The future was their problem. My present was finally, blessedly, quiet again. I stepped back from the doorway, out of the encroaching chill. The warmth of my living room enveloped me like an old, familiar blanket. The scent of old books and lavender was stronger now, no longer tainted by Diana's expensive perfume. The room was exactly as it had been, yet entirely transformed. It was no longer a beige prison waiting to be gutted, but a fortress that had withstood a siege. It was home, and it was safe. My gaze fell upon the shredded papers in the fireplace, a mess to be cleaned up tomorrow. Then to the empty chair where my son had sat, a hollow space filled with the echoes of his betrayal. I felt a pang, not of anger, but of a deep, sorrowful pity. He had lost so much more than a house or a trust fund tonight. He had lost his history. He had lost the last connection to his mother. He had lost his father. But that was a problem for another day. or perhaps for no day at all. My responsibility to him was over. The lesson had been delivered, the grade was final. My only duty now was to the promise I had made to Mary, to the quiet life we had built in this small, unassuming duplex, to the roses that would need watering in the morning, to the peace that I had so dearly won back for myself. The reversal was complete and absolute. I reached forward, taking the solid brass knob in my hand. The door swung shut with a quiet whoosh of displaced air, sealing off the night and the life I was leaving behind. I did not slam it. I simply closed it, firmly and with purpose. My thumb found the turn lock on the deadbolt. With a final satisfying snick, the bolt slid home.